Okay, so for this class, we're going to go over Polybius and his sort of historical account of the ancient Roman Republic at a time basically where it was already sort of transitioning to becoming an empire. Although, some confusion over that sometimes, over when exactly Rome became an empire. It was, officially pronounced at a later period of time than when Polybius is writing. But as we'll see, basically, Rome had already, in many ways become a de facto empire, even in the last, century or so, where it was still technically considered to be a republic. Anyway, as has become sort of common practice now, some notes from last class. So last class, we spent a lot of time talking about, just let some more people in, um, the idea of debt cancellation in the ancient world, the parallels with the modern world, and I spent some time talking about Michael Hudson, who's an interesting economist who has written on this topic quite extensively. So there are, I mean, sort of the theme of this class are the parallels between the Roman political institutions and the American ones. But you can certainly also draw a parallel between debt and financial practices within the ancient world, within the Roman world, and within the United States as well, and even on a global scale as well. So anyway, I mean, Hudson basically says that it is economic suicide when the financial class takes control over society. When the financial class has basically become dominant, the financial oligarchy, as it is sometimes known as, this essentially, signals the death knell of a society or even a civilization. This marks sort of the downward slide of society, whether it's in Rome, whether it's in Greece, and arguably whether or not it's in the United States today. The financial interests basically have a stranglehold over most aspects of American life, and there's a very real sense that this sort of marks the long-term decline of American society. Certainly, that is the parallel that Hudson is trying to draw, at least between the ancient world and the world that we live in. He does also talk a lot, about modern day economics as well. And one thing he points to a lot, I only have one note, but I have several charts and graphs basically to speak to this idea. So one thing that he speaks a lot about is the growth of the so-called FIRE sector of the economy, finance, insurance, and real estate, and how it has sort of overtaken the manufacturing part of the economy, what he calls the real economy, the productive part of the economy, and basically become the most dominant aspect of economic life within the United States. So as this chart shows you, basically from 1947 to 2017, you see in 1947, manufacturing made up over 25% of the economy. Today, in 2017, it makes up just slightly over 11%. Significant decline. That should not come as really a surprise to anybody. I mean, I think it's pretty common knowledge at this point that America is a de-industrializing economy. Factories are closing. Many of them have been outsourced to overseas, not just within the United States, of course, but really throughout the world, throughout the so-called developed world. Over 80% of manufacturing now takes place in what used to be considered third world countries, or I guess would today be considered underdeveloped countries. Over 80%, significant amount, obviously. Pretty much an unprecedented thing, really, in world history as well. Anyway, as manufacturing has declined, again, the productive part of the economy has declined. What Hudson calls, the parasitic part of the economy, the FIRE sector, has grown, and they've almost completely inverted. Whereas in 1947, the FIRE sector only made up about 10% of the economy today, or again, in 2017, it makes up a little over 20% of the economy. And by itself, the real estate sector makes up 12% of the economy. Now, this is a negative thing, according to Hudson. This marks the development of an unproductive, parasitic sector of the economy, basically overtaking the productive part of it. And again, how do financial people make their money? Through debt, basically, through interest payments on debt. And not surprisingly, you see a massive increase in debt within the United States. Of course, the common story that you often hear about is public debt, government debt, which is significant. Which today is valued at over $31 trillion. Very significant amount, very tidy sum, so to speak. Of course, most of that comes from bailouts for banks, military spending, and things like that. Well, those things in particular. But what you often don't hear about is how much private sector debt has increased, household debt, an enormous amount, far exceeding, in fact, government debt. And of course, what is driving that? Well, people, the cost of living goes up. People's wages have been stagnant. They go into more and more debt, and of course, financial interests profit off of that, but it basically hurts the economy as a whole. This is a statement from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. According to them, total household debt rose by 394 billion, or 2.4%, to 16.9 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2022. Credit card balances increased by 61 billion to reach 986 billion, surpassing the pre-pandemic high of 927 billion. Mortgage balances rose to 12 trillion. Auto loan balances rose to $1.5 trillion, and student loan balances to $1.6 trillion. The share of current debt transitioning into delinquency increased for nearly all debt types. So again, Americans basically are getting loaded up with more and more debt which they can never pay off fully. And of course, this is great for financial people who profit off of all these debts, but is basically bad for everybody else. And it's really, taking a toll not only on living standards for people. Again, as the cost of living goes up, life expectancy is falling within this country, but it's really bad for the economy as a whole. So just just look at that one figure. Student loan balance is 1.6 trillion. How much was Biden proposing to forgive in student loan debt? Like $3 billion. I mean, a very small amount, related to the overall, debt that's owed. And again, these are largely for, in many cases from public schools as well. It's not just, because everybody's going to Harvard and Princeton. It's because people are going to, public colleges like CUNY and Rutgers and various other places. Many of these schools used to basically be tuition free, but now they charge, incredibly high amounts of tuition. Maybe not quite as high as private schools like NYU, where I think the average annual tuition cost is I think like $70,000 or something like that, which is more than what most people make in a year. But still, a significant amount. So, but again, it's good for Wall Street. Pell Grants used to cover almost 72%. So you're saying that the costs, 72% of those costs used to basically be covered by grants, but not anymore. Yeah, but again, I mean, that's just that's sort of like putting like a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. The real issue, of course, is the rising cost of tuition. Again, in many cases, at schools that used to be entirely tuition free. I think I mentioned this last class. I mean, I'm not quite sure about Rutgers, but I certainly know that all of the CUNY schools, from the 19th century, basically up until the 1980s, were tuition free. That's City College, Brooklyn College, Queens College, and many others. So debt is out of control within the economy, basically. And like I said, not only is it having a severe negative effect upon, people, a decline in living standards. Obviously, when you're saddled with all these debts, more and more of your income has to go towards paying these debts rather than, using it for other things. But it's having a very negative effect on the economy as a whole. Again, as you can see here, GDP growth has been quite slow and has been, steadily dwindling downwards, not just over the last couple of years, but really, a decades long trend. As you can see here, I mean, it was quite high, within the 1950s for the most part, and still fairly high within the 1960s. But, basically since the 1970s has basically been slowing and slowing and slowing. And of course, that's because, again, as the real economy declines and more, wealth is basically, funneled to, essentially parasitic interests. It basically hurts the economy as a whole. The GDP is basically a measurement of the overall economy. And again, people are getting poorer, people are not buying stuff, people are not, consuming stuff as much. So it impacts the economy. It also kind of shows you, you see this massive fall in GDP in 1946. I mean, that was after World War II. And that was after the United States tried to demobilize and demilitarize its economy after World War II, at an incredibly negative effect. And basically, from that point forward, the U.S. economy has also been, I would say, a very unhealthy dependence, basically, on military spending as well. Another significant issue. But again, GDP growth has been falling, steadily slowing down. Now, some people would argue that, this is to be expected as an economy, becomes more, develops and becomes more of an advanced economy. The problem with that, though, is that, first of all, the American economy was already pretty developed, after World War II, but it grew, pretty extensively for a long period of time, or much higher than it does now. People often analogize this with like a human body. It's like when you're younger, you go through like a growth spurt and, you grow very, very quickly. And then as you get older, you don't grow as much. That might be true. The problem with that analogy, though, of course, is like, how far are you willing to stretch it? I mean, the United States economy is obviously not ultimately a human body. It's not even a material body. So I'm not sure how far you can really make that analogy stick. China, on the other hand, which is, sort of approaching the level of an advanced economy, its economy is growing like, 2 to 4 times faster than most of the other so-called advanced economies in the world. Productivity growth within the United States is falling. Let me make this smaller so you can see it better. But again, sort of the value of labor, how much output is produced by workers, but also the value of that output has also been steadily decreasing. Again, basically since the 1970s, and you see some increases here and there related to various things, lowering taxes, outsourcing, and things like that, which does help the economy to a certain extent, as it makes certain products cheaper. But again, overall, the productivity growth within the economy as a whole has been slow. And again, I mean, people are getting jobs, but the fairly typical example are people sort of moving out of industrial jobs, which are fairly high paying, particularly if you're not a college educated person, and getting kind of these like shitty service sector jobs, which don't pay much and don't have good benefits and things like that. So people are working, but they're working in jobs which are, they're not being paid well. And even, the value of their labor isn't really, creating much or not producing much. You see it, in many aspects of our economy. Again, as more and more, of the wealth of the economy is basically, sort of siphoned off and shifted into areas where it's not being used for productive purposes, including financial and real estate speculation. Most people today don't, fantasize about even being an entrepreneur, but, want to be like a social media influencer or something like that, which is fine. I guess you could make a lot of money doing that. The problem with that, though, is that it's not productive labor. And so you see, various ways in which, again, more and more people are moving into unproductive jobs. And productivity, again, is a very important part of the economy. I mean, that's basically what makes wages grow and what makes, living standards grow as well. Now, again, Hudson places a lot of emphasis on the growth of finance. The essentially that finance is a sort of parasitic sector of the economy, which is just sucking wealth out of the productive part of the economy. Another way to look at that, though, is the fall in the profit rate of the American economy. So this is an argument this is data by Michael Roberts, who's a Marxist economist, but kind of more of an old school Marxist economist, in that he still looks to the so-called law of the falling rate of profit, or the tendency for the profit rate to fall within a capitalist economy. Hudson, I think, is also a Marxist economist, but kind of a different kind. Marxists often fight over this idea of whether or not the falling profit rate matters a lot, and it's a very complicated idea to go into. But basically, the gist of it is that within a capitalist economy, there's a tendency for the profit rate to fall, absent any sort of counter forces or countervailing forces which can sort of push up that profit rate again. And for Roberts, the falling profit rate, the decline in investment within the economy, or rather a falling profit rate, leads to a decline in investment, which leads to a fall in productivity, which leads to smaller or slower GDP growth, which affects basically everything else. So the problem basically are sort of root aspects of a capitalist economy. And here he shows sort of a correlation between labor productivity and the rate of profit, and shows that there's a strong correlation between these things. So his argument is a little bit different from what Hudson is saying, rather. Roberts would say that financialization, the sort of transition to a more sort of parasitic financial economy, is kind of more a symptom of the disease, but not really the cause of it itself. The cause of it, he would argue, is within the falling profit rate. But basically everything else more or less follows from that. As investment falls within the economy, again, more and more wealth, instead of being invested into industry and productive growth, basically goes to parasitic forms of finance. Anyway, that's just something I wanted to mention from last class. It's sort of really how Hudson connects what he's talking about as far as debt within the ancient world to basically what's going on in the contemporary world. I think is a significant issue. Whether or not finance is the root cause or a symptom of a disease is another question. Personally, I'm more inclined to maybe accept what Roberts is saying about a falling rate of profit within a capitalist economy as maybe being the root cause of this. But they both at least agree that the growth of finance is certainly a harmful has a harmful effect on the economy as a whole. Anyway, so now switching over to today's readings. So Polybius is actually a Greek historian who's sort of living, after the Greek city-states had basically been conquered by Rome, and really is just, for the most part, just full of effusive praise for the Roman Republic and its sort of, balancing of different political institutions. And again, Polybius doesn't do this, of course, but many people sort of draw then an inference between his analysis of the Roman institutions and American political institutions. One of the people to have done that are Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, who talk about Polybius quite extensively in their book Empire. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it or read it. But Empire is an interesting book. It came out in 2000. It was really the first in a trilogy of books. Multitude was the follow-up to that, and then Commonwealth. I think, as far as I can tell, Empire made the biggest, impact, basically. For example, when I was in graduate school, several years after the book was first published, people were still talking about it a lot. I don't recall really people talking about the second two books as much, which, as far as I can tell, are kind of just sort of rehashing a lot of the same ideas anyway, and maybe trying to clarify some things. For example, Hart and Negri, despite the fact that they both call themselves communists, seem very pro-American in a lot of ways. They're also, their concept of empire, which they argue is sort of, rooted in, or sort of, the American political system sort of serves as a model for empire, sort of transcends nationality. That although you could speak of empire, which is kind of in many ways akin to what I guess people would call global capitalism, as well as the international and political institutions which kind of link different sites of global capitalism together. That is not truly an American empire or British empire or anything like that. It's just kind of empire. And the fact that this book was written in 2000, is kind of interesting in that regard, in that just shortly after this book was published, the U.S. begins this sort of 20-year war on terror, which many people argue was a way of really, asserting American dominance and hegemony, as the term is often called, across the rest of the world. It's an interesting idea. Now, so they are maybe trying to, first of all, maybe not come off as so pro-American in their later works, and maybe sort of, speak to this idea of is empire, really an American empire, or is it just something that sort of goes beyond just sort of one, national or one nation state sort of at the center of empire? And you could certainly argue, different points of view on that. I mean, you could perhaps say that maybe Hart and Negri are partly validated in when you sort of, evaluate how well the American war on terror, worked out. I mean, if it was an attempt to assert American dominance over the rest of the world, I would say it kind of backfired, right? I mean, almost anywhere that the U.S. intervened, and of course we're talking about Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria in particular, as well as many other places. I mean, almost anywhere where the U.S. put its, made its presence felt, kind of blew up in their faces, didn't it? I mean, how could you call any one of those interventions a success? So maybe that does speak to their idea that empire does sort of go beyond any one sort of nation state or any one kind of national empire trying to assert dominance over the rest of the world. On the other hand, people do argue that yes, this is actually an American empire. I mean, Hudson, for example, would I think be somebody who sort of falls into that category. America is an empire, and America does establish its sort of global dominance over the rest of the world. Its dominance may be fading, but that's not to say that's not a form of political power that is firmly rooted within the United States. Anyway, so Hart and Negri talk about Polybius quite extensively throughout their work, and frankly, that kind of, in many ways, is what motivated me to want to include Polybius within this class, because I thought their discussion of his ideas were kind of interesting. I actually have access to the text, and I'll actually post it on the module for the class in case you do want to read it. So it's a fairly long book, but I don't agree with everything that they say. I mean, a lot of what they are talking about is sort of steeped in this kind of Foucaultian, postmodern, post-structuralist kind of discourse. Deleuze and Guattari are also, thinkers that they, are influenced by a lot. I'm not really, so partial to that stuff, in all honesty. If anyone's ever heard of these thinkers, Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari. The criticism of their work is that it's this sort of pseudo leftist stuff. It's a lot of nonsensical jargon and things like that. It kind of went out of style really after 9/11 and even more so after the the economic crash of 2008. I think that's true to a certain extent. I think that a lot of what Hart and Negri talk about are fairly interesting, though. Yeah, Jerome.
Well, I can tell you, even in French, it's very, very hard to read.
To the point of being nonsensical, basically. At least that's
I mean, the conceptual elements are interesting. Like I know a bit about Foucault, biopower, the idea that discursive practices serve the relationship of powers. Definitely, it's interesting. But yeah, sometimes you just get bogged down in very abstract and conceptual elements. So you spend more time understanding the theory than understanding what the theory is meant to understand, in my own opinion.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of my opinion as well. And that seems to be the opinion of a lot of other people. Certainly they have their defenders as well, of course. Yeah, it does seem very jargon heavy in a way that seems unnecessary and seems to kind of, you know, not clarify, but do the opposite, you know, of clarify things. Again, I think this stuff was more sort of in fashion in the 1990s. I think ever since, basically, I think ever since the war on terror, and really also to a large extent the Great Recession, I think there's been a return to a more sort of, you know, if I could use this term, you know, sort of classic, you know, sort of grounded analysis of things, you know, in terms of power, in terms of classes, you know, especially after the economic crash of 2008. But anyway, Hart and Negri, you know, like I said, reference Polybius throughout their work, and I would imagine in their other works as well. And I've only read this book. In fact, I never read the follow-ups to it, which, again, as far as I could tell, did not really make the same kind of impact. Anyway, so what they say here is that about Polybius is that in the first place, Polybius's model of imperial Rome grounded more solidly the Republican process of the mediation of social powers and brought it to a conclusion in a synthesis of diverse forms of government. Now, one thing that's also kind of maybe a slightly misleading is that they throughout, you know, refer to Polybius talking about imperial Rome. But again, when Polybius is writing, Rome is still technically a republic. So you could argue that it's already at this point maybe become a de facto empire, but it was not, you know, basically, you know, officially proclaimed to be an empire, you know, almost, you know, a century later, you know, after Polybius. So keep that in mind. I mean, it's not that important, I guess, but they do tend to refer to that, you know, as imperial Rome throughout when technically he's still talking about the Republic. Polybius conceived the perfect form of power as structured by a mixed constitution that combines monarchic power, aristocratic power, and democratic power. The new political scientists in the United States organized these three powers as the three branches of the Republican Constitution. Any disequilibrium among these powers, and this is the second sign of Polybius's influence, is a symptom of corruption. So again, the basic idea that Polybius puts forward here is that, you know, the so-called greatness of the Roman Republic is that it's able to combine three different types of power. And that beyond that, it establishes what they call even a perfect balance or a sort of perfect equilibrium between these three, which in many ways is, I think, very much reminiscent, not just of the idea of a separation of powers within the United States, executive, legislative, and judicial, but the so-called, you know, the much flaunted, you know, system of checks and balances. The idea that each branch of government sort of controls the other one or sort of regulates the other branch of government to a significant extent. Again, Rome represented the pinnacle of political development because it combined the good forms of government along with the system of checks and balances. So, in many ways, you know, Polybius seems to be influenced by Aristotle here. Of course, Aristotle, you know, coined the you know, the classic typology of different political orders or different political regimes. And it does, for the most part, you know, follow Aristotle's designation of what he calls the good governments: monarchy, aristocracy, and for Aristotle, polity, right? But polity is kind of a mixture of democratic and oligarchic influences as well as others. So even for Aristotle, he places, you know, great emphasis on this idea of a kind of mixed form of government, which seems to be also what Polybius is talking about as well. And of course, for Aristotle, the sort of perverted forms of government are sort of like the mirror opposite of the good form. So if monarchy is the good form of government, then tyranny is the bad form. Although again, remember back to last class, Hudson says that the Greek tyrants were actually the good guys who were trying to, free the people from, debt and cancel debts and free people from debt slavery and things like that. But be that as it may, the word tyranny, or the concept of tyranny, as it has come down to us, obviously has a very negative connotation to it. The negative version of aristocracy is oligarchy. So aristocracy is sort of a rule by the virtuous few. Oligarchy is basically ruled by the few, but now not virtuous people, but basically by, greedy rich people, essentially, is what he's saying, what Aristotle says. And then you get into a little bit of conceptual confusion here, because Aristotle says that democracy is the bad form of government. He says it's the least bad form of government, but a bad form of government. But then he says that a polity is a good form of government, which is also kind of like democracy, but it's sort of a regulated democracy. It's democracy, again, with essentially checks and balances on it. Whereas I guess you would assume for Aristotle, democracy in the bad sense is basically a democracy where there's no restraints at all, basically, upon the popular majority, which could easily translate into what people often refer to as mob rule and things like that. So, Polybius's idea is very, similar, almost exactly the same, in fact, although the only significant difference here is this idea of the democratic power being the good form of power. Again, very similar to what Aristotle talks about. And I would imagine that for Polybius as well, he when he talks about democratic power, he also means democracy, but also sort of with, checks and balances and some kind of restraints upon it. And again, because according to Polybius, Rome had achieved this perfect balance of the three, that it breaks out of this so-called cycle of political decay. So this is something, again, that's, extensively talked about by both Plato and Aristotle, and even by Aeschylus, quite frankly, is that, political orders come into being, but then they also fall apart. And how do you sort of get out of that cycle? Well, according to Polybius, it comes through this sort of, perfect balancing of these different types of power, this sort of perfect mixture, a perfect cocktail, if you will, of political order. And I would say that, modern day political science is very much still, primarily consumed with this today, especially in the more sort of, empirically oriented aspects of political science. So this is, political theory. We're going over different sort of, theories of politics and different sort of theoretical ideas of politics. But the more, which also, obviously is a concern here about how do you maintain democratic government as a theoretical question. But in the more sort of, empirically oriented aspects of political science, that very much, consumes most, if not all, of, research. How do you identify things that strengthen political order? How do you prevent democratic orders from breaking down or collapsing? Now, I think you could take some issue with how democracy is defined in mainstream political science. I think in many ways it tends to be more of a formality, maybe sort of lacking a bit of substance, the substance of democratic rule, popular sovereignty, and things like that. But anyway, I mean, that's a separate question. But, again, I mean, modern day, political science now, like I said, is still very much concerned with these key questions, basically the same questions that preoccupied ancient thinkers as well, which is, essentially, how do you preserve a political order? Presumably a good, political order. Or if you have a bad political order, how do you change it? How do you reform it so that it becomes a good political order? So they refer to the Hart and Negri refer to the new science of politics, or the new political scientists. This is a direct reference to Federalist number 9. Again, Hart and Negri are often criticized for being very, seemingly being very pro-American in many ways. Anyway, from the Federalist Papers, which if you don't know, were basically essays written in favor of ratification of the Constitution, mostly written by Hamilton and Madison as well, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Hamilton wrote most of them. John Jay wrote a couple as well. He often gets overlooked. They were published under a pseudonym of Publius, another ancient Roman figure. So their authorship was not known at that time. I believe there's not much of a debate over the authorship of who wrote what. I think some are kind of disputed a little bit over whether or not Hamilton or Madison wrote them. Anyway, Federalist 9 is, at least generally, believed to have been written by Hamilton. And here he references the so-called science of politics, he says. However, like most other sciences, has received great improvement. The efficacy of various principles is now well understood, which were either not known at all or imperfectly known to the ancients. The regular distribution of power into distinct departments, the introduction of legislative balances and checks, the institution of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior, the representation of the people in the legislature by deputies of their own election. These are wholly new discoveries or have made their principal progress towards perfection in modern times. They are means and powerful means by which the excellences of Republican government may be retained and its imperfections lessened or avoided. So this, again, very much references the same kind of thing that Polybius is talking about. You have this sort of, separation of political power into different branches of government. You have a kind of regulation among the different branches of government. And this leads to good government. And again, Hart and Negri, largely agree with this idea, even though they're coming from a very sort of, left-wing point of view. Now, you could argue within communist states or so-called communist states, they also kind of see this, right? You see, at a lower level, popular assemblies, workers' councils, and things like that. The sort of aristocratic aspect of power would be like the Politburo or something like that. And then, of course, you have the leader, whether it's Mao, Lenin, or Stalin, or whoever, Kim Jong-un. You do kind of see that structure replicated to some extent within communist states. Although, of course, the criticism would be is that the undemocratic aspects of it. Although that's the thing. I mean, one of the things which I'll try to explore later on in the class is really how democratic really is the American political system. Hart and Negri seem to argue very clearly that it is. They seem very much taken by the idea of democracy in America, and I think you could certainly raise some objections to that idea, as well as for that matter to what extent was the Roman Republic democratic, right? Certainly Hudson would argue that the oligarchy had by this point had essentially assumed power, that they were systematically sort of killing off all the representatives of the people, the tribunes and people like that, as their economic power grew, basically. So this is from Federalist 10, the next essay in the series, and this one's believed to have been written by Madison. Now, I already read an excerpt from this in a previous class when we talked about the importance of classes, right? That Madison specifically refers to the idea of class conflict as a major part of political conflict, basically within society, something a view shared by Aristotle as well. Anyway, sort of going on now to another aspect of this argument, which is again, how do you preserve political order? Madison here is taken with this idea of faction, and again, Madison finds that the greatest source of factional conflict within society are basically disputes over property. Okay, so that being the case, how do you control it? How do you sort of stop factions from basically destroying society. So Madison says in a very famous passage, he says, there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, the other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy that it was worse than the disease. Kind of reflecting what Thomas Friedman said about, COVID, right? The cure can't be worse than the disease, referring to, lockdowns and things like that. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. So you can't get rid of the causes of faction, he's saying. Factions are sort of come out of the sort of spontaneous existence of freedom within society. If you live in a free society, you're going to have people that have differences of opinion and different economic interests as well. But it would not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. So he says you can't control the causes of faction. All you can do basically is control the effects. And how do you control the effects? Well, basically by the Constitution, by this kind of mixed, system of government, basically, which combines different forms of political power. That's how you control the effects of faction. Now, again, how well is that actually working? I believe when I referenced this essay in a prior class, if the goal of the constitutional system is to prevent factional conflicts and the polarization of class conflict, basically from destroying society, then it's done a very bad job of that, especially in recent years. And again, I think maybe this is one reason maybe why a lot of things that Hart and Negri are talking about maybe haven't aged all that well. Sure, things may have looked a little bit different in the 90s when it seemed as if class conflict was at a fairly low level of intensity. Not to say it wasn't still sort of bubbling underneath the surface of society, but certainly in the years since, certainly it's once again, I would say, come to the forefront of political conflict. I think you would be fairly foolish to deny that, in fact. And again, if the purpose of our political system is to prevent these things from escalating to that point, then it's really an indictment of our political system. Yes, it may have been able to sustain itself for a long period of time, but most things come to an end. So, who's to say that we're not sort of now reaching that point where this political system is finally breaking down? I mean, the fact that we have, presidents trying to, lead coups to, overthrow the government, I think is a very, indicative sign of how badly, the political crisis, motivated by an economic crisis, has gotten, to this point. The growth of fascism. I mean, the fact it's so, obvious and overt now. The fact that the sort of, moderate center seems so ineffective at dealing with things, as well as the left within this country. Certainly, I don't see any really cause for optimism there. So yes, I mean, you would have to, of course, agree with Hart and Negri that yes, the American political order is a very durable political order, or has been for many years. I think you can certainly question how democratic it is. And I think you can certainly question in the present day, how sustainable is it in the long run? I mean, how much longer can the system really continue under the current circumstances, absent any, significant changes? Certainly something to question. Now, a little more disturbingly, and this is also, an idea shared by Madison and Hamilton, is that expansion is a very important part of this. The Roman Republic needs to constantly expand. So besides just having the different types of political power, besides having the perfect balance of these political powers, another thing that has to be done to prevent this order from decaying is that it needs to constantly expand and grow. Well, how do you do that forever? Where does that process reach its limit? Certainly, the Romans did obviously reach its limit. And again, how much more can, American power expand? Again, going back to Madison, Madison also makes that argument. Madison says that a large republic is better than a small republic, which kind of stands the conventional notion of popular rule on its head. Another thing I guess I have to point out is that, of course, the idea of democracy was kind of a dirty word, right, to the American founders. Democracy has sort of been something that's kind of evolved over time. And later on, I'll show you another quote from Hamilton, interestingly enough. So this is, Hamilton in public, speaking, in front of an audience that, he knows is going to be fairly widely read. Later on, I'll show you another quote by Hamilton in private, and you should see what he has to say about the people behind closed doors. So the idea of democracy, of popular rule, they didn't completely dismiss it, but they certainly wanted to keep it under very strict controls to varying degrees, which I think Hamilton pretty much wanted the strictest controls over it. But again, Madison argues that yes, a larger republic will be better because it'll encompass more people, more different groups, and that these different sort of groups will kind of balance each other out. So essentially almost like extending the idea of checks and balances to society as well. The more sort of, groups that you have within society, the more different interests that you have, the more these interests will kind of check and balance each other, he says. Now, again, the conventional notion of democratic rule prior to that is that democracy could only really exist on a very small scale, right? At best, the level of like a city, and a fairly small city at that, right? You couldn't even imagine it, in a modern day city like New York, for example. But again, as the political order gets larger and larger, as the society gets larger and larger, it becomes impossible to maintain that system of so-called direct democracy, which maybe the closest version of that we've ever seen would have been in ancient Athens. But again, even in ancient Athens, I think only like 10% of the people could actually vote that lived within the city. So both Polybius and Madison and Hamilton take this idea that, constant expansion is actually a good thing, but that obviously has some disturbing aspects to it, because obviously as the republic expands, what's going to happen when it comes upon other territories? What happens when it comes upon other political orders? It's going to come into conflict with them, obviously, and that's going to lead then to a struggle. And in the case of Rome, it's going to lead to Rome, obviously, conquering other areas and gobbling them up and making them part of the Roman Republic and then later Empire. In the United States, of course, and again, this is something which Hart and Negri tend to gloss over a lot. Of course, the United States, since its very earliest origins, has been constantly expanded from the 13 colonies across the continental United States, and then to the extent where it's become basically a global power, a global empire, if you will. But is that something that should be celebrated? What has happened along the way? Think about the expansion of the United States just across the continent. What did that entail? Stealing land from Mexico, stealing land from the Native Americans, breaking basically every treaty that the United States ever signed with Native American nations. These are things that Hart and Negri tend to gloss over to a large extent, as well as, of course, Polybius tends to gloss over the very violent conquest of Rome over most of the rest of the Mediterranean. Again, so he says that without expansion, the republic would be consumed by corruption. Polybius, you could say in many ways, is an apologist for imperial power. He's making, excuses essentially for imperial conquest. And he's a Greek too. In some ways that almost makes it worse. He's not even a Roman. He's a Greek who's sort of celebrating Rome's conquest of Greece, of the Greek city-states. Hart and Negri, in a very similar way, argue that the American constitutional order establishes a new model of sovereignty or rule. Sovereignty means rule, basically. That again eventually expands to cover the world, and this is what they mean by empire. Now, again, the term empire, definitely caught on. I mean, many people use that term now. But again, when Hart and Negri talk about it, they're talking about empire in a sense that sort of, I guess you could say, transcends nationality. They would argue against the idea, in other words, that empire is simply the American empire. But is that the case? I mean, I tend to go back and forth on that to a large extent. I mean, I certainly see what they're talking about. Essentially, if you sort of break this term down a little bit, and what they mean by empire is, again, as essentially global capitalism that's sort of spread out among most of the world at this point, although certainly more concentrated in some parts of the world more than others, and sort of the political and international institutions that kind of link global capitalism together. And in their view of things, the U.S. plays a very privileged role, a very important role, but ultimately a subordinate role. So I'm not so sure, I'm question that idea. Again, I can kind of see what they say. Others would say that no, it is in fact an American empire, that America in fact is spreading its own dominance over the world. Look at the fact, when you look at these international institutions like the IMF and even the United Nations and things like that. I mean, the US does maintain a kind of veto power over all these institutions. I mean, no other country has that ability, that they can essentially, cancel out anything that these other institutions do. That they essentially control the IMF and the World Bank and a lot of these so-called international institutions. Again, this is a point that Hudson makes, that these institutions are really misnamed. The IMF should be called the American Monetary Fund. The World Bank should be called the American Bank. These institutions were basically created by the United States in large part and basically serve the interests of the United States. So there's very much a kind of running debate here to what extent empire is sort of transnational or to what extent it's national. And I'm not, quite honestly, I'm not sure which one I believe. I think I kind of maybe lean more towards the idea of American empire, but I could certainly see the other point of view as well. For Hart and Negri, again, America is essentially almost like the hitman of empire. It's like the enforcer for empire. So it has all this military power, but this military power is sort of used at the behest of international or multinational corporations and things like that. So when we go invade Iraq, it's like, we're performing a hit, so to speak, if you kind of follow the mafia analogy here, that the United States is sort of hitting other performing hits or on other countries at the behest of something even more powerful than the US itself. Yeah, Jerome.
So if I understand this correctly, if we reinterpret Polybius's view, a Republican form of government necessarily comes with some extent, some degree of imperialism, right?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. So I mean, again, and that's a disturbing idea for many people. I mean, to what extent are those things really complementary to each other? I mean, many people question this now. I mean, can the United States really be both a democracy, or at least a democratic republic, and an empire at the same time, if it is an empire? Again, so you're going back and forth here. But so let me try to explain a little bit more how they sort of link American institutions to this idea of empire. So if you look at the American political system, there is a president, but the president doesn't reign like an emperor, right? That the American political system is sort of a decentralized system of power, where again, the different sort of aspects or the different institutions of the American political system kind of check and balance each other. In a very similar way, they argue that empire, as they refer to it as, and usually it is referred to by, like a capital E to sort of distinguish it from other empires, I guess, national empires, is that empire sort of works in the same way. It's this sort of decentralized structure. There's power, but there's not one sort of entity or not one sort of nation state at the center of the empire. So they would, again, argue against this idea that there is an American empire. America plays a privileged role within empire, an important role within empire, but it's not necessarily directing all things, that the empire itself kind of works in a way in which the American political system works, just sort of covering the whole world, basically. Anyway, so just, in a very sort of dialectical argument, although they seem to argue against dialectics to some extent, but just as Marx and Engels would argue that capitalism contains socialism within its womb, term that Marx specifically uses, that capitalism basically gives birth to socialism, Hart and Negri seem to make the same argument regarding empire. So it's not that they're apologists for empire, they're not apologists for global capitalism, but they seem to be arguing in a very similar way that empire is sort of making possible the conditions for what they call, counter empire, or sort of the dialectical opposite of empire, which is an interesting argument. So this really sort of takes into question, how do we evaluate the changes that the last several decades have unleashed upon the world? Global trade and global, the globalization of production. Are these negative things? I mean, are these positive things? Is the fact that production does now take place in the former third world, which, of course, China playing a very predominant role in that, is that something to be celebrated to a certain extent? Is that in fact making, setting the conditions for a more globally cooperative world in the future? I mean, again, Marx and Engels certainly don't downplay the brutality of capitalism, but they also argue that it's basically sort of setting the conditions for a better society, which will come after that. So in a similar way, you could certainly look at the brutal aspects of global capitalism and argue that that is also sort of setting the conditions for a more globally cooperative society in the future, kind of global socialism, if you will, instead of global capitalism. So it's an interesting argument. And, again, I think there's probably some aspect to that. I don't necessarily think that the fact that, industry has moved to third world countries is a bad thing. I'm certainly against the idea, and of course, Trump certainly popularized this idea, right, of America first. And, we're going to bring all the factory jobs back to the United States and things like that. Well, first of all, I don't think that can be done. And secondly, even if you could, I don't know if that is a good thing. Is that necessarily a good thing for the world? Maybe not. I mean, again, China is a perfectly good example. I mean, China, of course, is a fast-growing economy. The trouble with all these kinds of dialectical arguments, of course, is that you never want to sound too enthusiastic for what's going on within these countries. But again, is this sort of setting the stage for something better? Is China becoming a better society as it grows, economically speaking? I would think so to a large extent. I certainly don't think you could argue that China was better when it was a poorer country, even before 1949, even before the communist takeover. So there's definitely something to that, I think. My major objection with what Hart and Negri are saying is that, one, I think they certainly overstate how democratic the American political system is. And two, I tend to think that, yes, I think you can maybe accurately speak of more of an American empire than just empire in this sort of transnational sense. But other than that, I think a lot of what they say makes at least some sense, and that the sort of growth of production throughout the world and things like that probably is a good thing overall. Although that might be kind of a controversial argument. but again, you understand how bad things are, but you're also sort of, arguing that it's sort of setting the stage for something better to come in the future. So this would be more or less the Roman territories around the time in which Polybius is writing. He was born basically, somewhere circa 200 BCE or BC. I think died around 118 BC. Of course, these are all approximate dates. So he would have more or less lived to see this happen. So the green areas refer to basically Roman territories in 200 BCE, and where, to the extent to which Roman power had basically extended by 100 BC or BCE. And so he would have lived through a lot of this, including, again, the conquest of the Greek city-states, as you can see, Western Turkey, North Africa, parts of North Africa, including, most importantly, Carthage. Of course, the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage are very well known. Large parts of Spain, again, and even parts of southern France, as well as, modern day, the Balkan states, Slovenia and Croatia and stuff, parts of it. So, and again, of course, you can see quite clearly that, most of its power is sort of, concentrated around the Mediterranean region. So again, commerce and trade plays a large role in this as well. It's not just all about, armies and fighting and things like that. It's basically, extending Roman commercial power or economic power across this region as well. So Rome certainly did expand, and it would expand even more, to the point where basically it had conquered pretty much all of Europe, including even parts of the British Isles, which sort of figures into British history. I talked about that a little bit, earlier on in the class. And as far east, basically through what we would, today refer to as the Middle East, or what Hudson would call the Near East. So much so that the Roman Empire was later split into two, right? You had the Western Roman Empire, which we, generally is what we call the Roman Empire. And then the Eastern Roman Empire, based out of Constantinople, today's Istanbul. Of course, you think about that major earthquake that just happened. And the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which later became known as the Byzantine Empire, lasted for centuries after the Roman Empire collapsed, the Western Roman Empire. Hudson would argue, attribute that to them, adopting the practice of debt cancellation, but that's another topic. But anyway, so, again, Roman power certainly expanded. And again, at this point, it was still, nominally speaking, or in theory, at least, a republic. And of course, the expansion of American power, the expansion of American territory, I think is so, pretty well known. I don't think I have to show a map to demonstrate that. All right, so we've talked about this sort of interaction between monarchical power, aristocratic power, and democratic power. So how do these three forms of power relate to each other? So again, I'll use Hart and Negri here. They argue that the monarchy, as they say, anchors the unity and continuity of power. It is the foundation of imperial rule. So what do they mean by that? It anchors the unity and continuity of power. I take that to mean that in many ways, again, the monarch, which you would assume maybe is the most powerful, kind of serves in many ways sort of like a kind of figurehead. It's sort of like a symbol of power, but maybe doesn't wield that much direct power on their own. Now, again, this is, before you had the Roman emperors. So at this point, the kind of, the monarchical power within Rome was sort of invested within these two offices, these two positions known as consuls. Cicero served as, which I talked about last class. And the consuls, basically, there's two of them, so they kind of checked each other as well. They were in command of, the military for the most part. And they, basically would form what we today refer to as the executive branch of government. But they, they couldn't do that much on their own. That's another important thing. So again, they sort of serve as sort of like the face of power, a symbol of power. but aside from that, don't really have that much power on their own. Now, how important is it to have that symbol of power? How important is it to have that face of power? People talk about that today, for example, with the British royal family. And I don't really get it. I especially don't get Americans' fascination with the British royal family at all. But apparently a lot of people seem to like them and even, attribute some significance to them other than just a tourist attraction, I guess, that, kind of going back to what I just said, that they actually serve as, the Queen or whoever's in charge now, Prince Charles, I guess, or King, I guess he's King Charles now, whatever. Sort of give actually like a sense, again, of sort of national unity or purpose. But I have to admit, I find a lot of these concepts very sort of vague and abstract to a certain extent. Yeah, Jerome.
I suppose you could make a point about a king being some sort of continuity over time of national identity. Thing is, I suppose you can also do that with a president in a parliamentary regime. Having somebody who is like an arbiter who is not as politically committed as the prime minister, like sort of represents some sort of an arbiter. That's a very French way of looking at it, with somebody who would represent the people without committing too much to politics. I guess you can kind of make an argument with that.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, and the French political system is interesting in that, they have both a president and a prime minister. Not a lot of other countries do. Well, some do. Yeah, and I understand that idea of being a kind of arbiter, I guess you could say. I just wonder, is it really that essential? The idea would be that if you took this out of the mix, that the whole system would fall apart. I really wonder if that is the case. But anyway, that is the argument that they make. That's certainly the argument that Polybius makes as well. So I guess we'll just leave it at that. Anyway, moving on now to aristocracy. They argue that it defines justice and virtue and spreads these concepts through what they call social networks. Interesting use of the term. It oversees the reproduction and circulation of imperial rule. So the idea that the aristocrats define basically, I guess you could say, culture. The monarch can't do it themselves if it's one person or two people. That they're too isolated, I guess, in a sense that sort of the upper elite, the ruling class, sort of defines sort of the higher values, defines what virtue is, and sort of spreads this by example or by some sort of I guess basically by example of sort of like a model of behavior, I guess. And it sort of, it disseminates itself through their own kind of social networks, which again are more extensive than what you'd see at the monarchical level. And as far as the lower classes go, I guess it sort of serves as kind of a role model or something to emulate. Look at the way in which people sort of, model themselves after, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and things like that. Though whether or not those are, good role models or not, is another question entirely. But I guess you could see the point, at least. If you're not basically arguing for a more radical idea of democracy. Again, to what extent do you really need these monarchical institutions, aristocratic institutions? I'm not necessarily sure. It is the argument that Hart and Negri make. It is the argument that Polybius is making as well. Yeah, Jerome.
I think you're making a very interesting point in that, well, in most societies, you still have de facto social elites, and who have a lot of what can be referred as intellectual capital, people who constitute most of the thinkers, of the people who change their ideas. And you have this question of, should these people, is it fair to have a system in which these people contribute that much, and in that during the process keeps so much of power. That's why you have a lot of people who are usually labeled as quotation mark populist would basically want to get rid of that because they think we don't need some sort of a special class to organize and to develop the way we think. But those people on the other hand would say, yeah, but you need some sort of technocracy in a sense to make things rule normally. So I think that's an interesting debate we have here.
Sure, yeah. I mean, again, I guess I can sort of see both sides of the issue. Here, it seems to be not even really making an argument for technocracy or the idea of sort of an managerial class, and that also brings, brings to mind the idea of what people often refer to as the PMC, right? The professional and managerial class. And oftentimes it's talked about in a very critical way, right? That's sort of an undemocratic elite that's sort of usurping power from the people, so to speak. That's an interesting question. I mean, here they seem to be more, like I would say, it seems more like they're talking about them almost as a kind of role model or some sort of model example for other people to sort of, emulate their conduct, or maybe to teach people, that's a sort of playing almost like a educational. So, again, it's an interesting argument. I mean, make of it what you will. Like I said, I'll provide the text as well if you want to, read into it more. And I have, listed some of the page numbers where they're taking these quotes from or taking these ideas from. Finally, you get to the idea of democracy, what they call the multitude. And again, so democracy is a way of sort of organizing what they, I guess, take to be the sort of, chaotic sort of mass of people, I guess, and sort of, organizes it in a way, sort of gives it direction and focus. And there's this kind of sort of mutual feedback system which happens where that, people are sort of both brought under the rule of the regime, as they say, but the regime, in theory at least, is meant to satisfy the needs of the people as well. So people sort of learn, I guess, the benefits of order and structure, and the kind of reward that they get for it, I guess, is that the government sort of acts to satisfy their needs. Now, again, I mean, a lot of this, depends upon, how democratic really is the system. And again, Hart and Negri, like I said, often get criticized for seemingly to overestimate the democratic aspects of the American political system, as well as, you could then also say, to how democratic was the Roman Republic, especially during the time in which Polybius is arguing. I would certainly, push back against both of those claims. I think you can make a pretty good argument that neither were particularly democratic at all. But again, I mean, that is, what they assume and what they place a lot of their emphasis on. And so again, so the sort of, this sort of perfect balancing of political order comes from each of these systems of power, essentially monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, basically sort of organizing themselves, sort of counterbalancing each other. And again, sort of, a good political order results from, what they call literally the perfect balancing of this order. So when Hart and Negri talk about empire, and again, how this sort of, extends itself onto the global scale, they mean that the role of monarchy is sort of played by, or sort of, taken over by this monopolization of force, which you would assume means the United States. So the US sort of plays the monarchic role within empire, as a whole, empire on a global scale, that the US is kind of like the monarch. It monopolizes force. It has the most powerful military. Yes, there are other things like NATO and things like that, but I think everyone pretty much knows that the US is the main power behind that. It does raise an interesting question, when you have sort of military powers that develop outside of that, like China, for example, although China's military spending is still significantly lower than what the U.S. spends. It does raise, issues there. But I think it's, pretty safe to say that the U.S. does kind of play that, right? The U.S. does kind of monopolize force on a global scale, which again, they seem to be assuming is sort of used for good purposes. I mean, it's a very strange argument for so-called, communists to be making, but this is the argument that they are making. Again, I have to stress again, this book was written, before 2001. And I think, certainly since then there's certainly many reasons to question this idea. But again, this is the argument that they're making. The aristocratic role is played by multinational corporations and nation states. So that's an interesting interpretation of the idea of aristocracy on a global scale. That basically the big giant corporations essentially now play that role, along with certain powerful nation states. And again, you would assume the US, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, maybe a handful of others playing that role as well. And the democratic role, again, played by nation states, I guess other nation states, the less powerful ones, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, media, and other what they refer to as popular organisms. So this is how sort of empire works, sort of decentralized structure of power sort of works on a global scale. So they say. Oh, okay, I mean, that's what they say. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that idea, but it is a compelling idea. I do think, like I said, I think there's something to be said for the fact that I don't think the U.S. can just dominate every aspect of the world. Like I said, in their view of things, the U.S. kind of plays almost like the role of like a hitman or like an enforcer, basically, like an enforcer for empire. And that might be true, but again, I mean, I think the U.S. is sort of, could you argue then that the U.S. is sort of going rogue? The U.S. is sort of becoming like a renegade state, which is just sort of, bucking the authority of the rest of the world and just sort of, going out on its own. I don't know, but like I said, I'm more inclined to thinking that this is actually kind of an American empire. Maybe I'm being influenced more by the events of the last several years. I would agree with the sentiment that we're sort of seeing the limits of American power, of American imperial power, especially if you interpret the war on terror in light of that as an attempt basically to sort of, extend or at least preserve American global power. I think it failed miserably in that regard. Almost everywhere where the U.S. intervened, completely, backfired and did the opposite. I mean, the embarrassment of the U.S. sort of propping up. I mean, forget Iraq for a second, which is a more well-known example. But I mean, even the fact that we propped up this government in Afghanistan for 20 years, and then as soon as we brought our forces out of it, or at least most of them, the government collapsed within a matter of weeks. I mean, that's an embarrassing thing to spend that long of a time trying to create a stable government, which just had no credibility at all. And then, of course, it raises the whole question, well, what were we doing there in the first place? Why were we there for 20 years trying to prop up a government which could not be propped up, which was impossible to prop up, to create a government, not the Taliban, but another government that could sustain itself in any way. And again, Libya and Syria and many other examples, I think, would really show you, the limits of American power. So if anything, I think the war on terror, rather than strengthening American empire, has kind of showed that, the U.S. in many ways to be kind of what people would call a paper tiger. It looks tough on paper. It looks impressive, but when you really look closely at it or really, challenge it, you can see in many ways it's, fairly weak. Even our, ability now. I mean, how much, weapons and money have we poured into the Ukraine, and we can't even, really win there as well. And you wonder where that is going to lead to. What kind of escalation is going to come out of that. On the other hand, Putin, has, it's basically ground into a stalemate. I mean, Hitler conquered all of Europe in less time than it's taken Putin to conquer the Ukraine. But the U.S. At the same time has also basically been, unsuccessful basically at, stopping, the Russian invasion as well, unless of course that's really what it wanted me. Anyway, so Hart and Negri also place a lot of emphasis on Machiavelli, as do the American founders. And Machiavelli himself was very much influenced by Polybius as well. So from Machiavelli, he sort of takes up this idea, the monarchy, again, to him represents unity and force. The aristocracy represents the land, basically the landlords and the army. So essentially where you raise the army from, as well as, the peasants and, serfs that are forced to fight on, who occupy the land. And democracy, basically, for Machiavelli, represents cities, the urban areas, and money, commerce, basically. So you think of, the Italian city-states like Florence, where Machiavelli was from, Genoa, and other places like that. Now, again, Machiavelli also believes that for a republic to escape corruption, it must expand. So again, this is a very, disturbing and sobering lesson, but what they're all arguing here is that to maintain a republican form of government, it must conquer other places, it must conquer other areas, more or less on a continuous basis, or at least there's never really a definitive end to it. So again, for Polybius and Machiavelli, of course that would be hard to imagine, just one power conquering the whole rest of the world. But now in the modern day, where something like that is, if not possible, at least, you could conceive of it. Where does that really take you? I mean, where again does American power end to that extent? Does it just eventually come up to a point where it just overextends itself so far that you sort of realize, the limitations of its power that way, as I would argue that the war on terror has done? You could also, even though it was several centuries after Polybius was writing, but you could also make that argument about the Roman Empire as well, right? It eventually just became so overextended that it basically collapsed. So I would argue that, the very basic argument that they're making is flawed, right? This idea that, continuous expansion is how you break out of the cycle of political decay is wrong. I mean, eventually what happens is that you expand so far that you collapse from within. So that's a very important, objection, I think, that they can raise to the argument that Polybius is trying to make. Yeah, Jerome.
It's quite a general question, but if I remember correctly, Machiavelli wrote paradoxical things at different times of his life. So are you on the side of people who thinks that he was actually a very cynical person and disregarding democracy and republic, or are you more on the side of people who believe that he was more ironic while writing The Prince, and he was more defending more democratic ideas?
I think Machiavelli is more on the side of republican government, if that answers if that answers your question. I think when and that actually leads me to my next point, that there are essentially two Machiavellis. There's the Machiavelli of the Prince, who's sort of writing this guidebook to how to, sort of be like a ruthless, leader. It's better to be loved. It's better to be feared than loved, and all of that. There are many who argue that that's not really where Machiavelli's heart was in. He did not necessarily believe that was the best type of political order. But if you were a prince, that, he was going to try to counsel you to sort of be the best type of, prince that you could be, essentially someone who has power, concentrated power within their own hands. Some argue that it's almost like a satirical work, that Machiavelli paints, a successful leader as so bad that it almost makes you, self-evident that you would not want to follow along or not want to submit yourself to this kind of rule. That's what he's most well known for, right? But he wrote a work after The Prince known as the Discourses, actually the Discourses on Livy, another Roman historian. where he argues basically in favor of Republican government, modeled, basically on, again, the Roman Republic. And this seems to be much more where his heart seems to lie, and it seems to be the kind of government that he seems to favor. In fact, in several places, he argues explicitly that a Republican government is better than government, concentrated in the hands of one ruler. And it's interesting the arguments that he makes to that extent, right? Seemingly, the most important argument is that he argues that a Republican form of government is more adaptable. It's more flexible. It can change easier under changing circumstances, which is a very important, plays a very important role within Machiavelli's, theory of politics, or his philosophy of politics. The idea of being that, the world is changing, circumstances change, and you need to be able to adapt and change along with it. Those who don't adapt are screwed, basically. And even in The Prince, I mean, he sort of extends that argument into talking about, so-called princely rule as well. A good prince, again, is somebody who's able to adapt and change. The problem with, rulers like that is that they often become very rigid, and they don't want to change, and they don't want to be flexible, and they tend to become very dogmatic in their views. So being that that is the case, being that that is often the case with that kind of rule, Machiavelli argues that a Republican government, where you have sort of a circulation of different leaders, and again, sort of a more, both a decentralized political structure, but also a political structure where the leadership roles are changing periodically, he argues gives you a more, flexible, adaptive form of government, which he argues would be superior. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think yes, being able to adapt and change to circumstances is very important. And the lack of, lacking that kind of flexibility often is disastrous. And honestly, I would argue that, COVID kind of shows that. I mean, the lack of adaptability, the slowness to adapt to changing circumstances certainly has not, played a beneficial role to people living here and elsewhere. The fact that, authorities, employers, school officials have been so slow to adapt to, the changing circumstances outside of our control, I don't think has been to anyone's real advantage that we've been so slow to change and adapt to those things. Anyway, as we get more and more into the Federalist and into the American system, this idea that you have a specific monarch and aristocratic, Hart and Negri talk about the change from political bodies to functions. That it's more about the role that's being played rather than the fact that this power is invested within a specific political body, like a king or a council of elders or something like that. Which I'll talk about more. But anyway, I mean, this idea that Machiavelli played a big role on the American founders is, basically since the 1970s at least, become much more of a kind of mainstream view. So one important book written on this is called The Machiavellian Moment by J.G.A. Pocock, first written in 1975. And what Pocock argues is that a so-called Machiavellian moment occurs when a new republic first confronts problems of stability. So it's very easy to form a new government. Well, not easy, but it's easy to be idealistic, and we're going to let the people rule, and all that. And but when you actually come up face to face with real issues of stability and political conflict that aren't easily resolved, what do you do basically? And I would say that Pocock really sort of established the importance of Machiavelli within the American political tradition. So I mean it's a work of history. It's a historical book, but it's also a book of political theory as well. And that Pocock does fairly extensive historical research to demonstrate the influence of Machiavelli upon the American founders, something which was not really that well known prior to that. Pocock also argues that Machiavelli was a strong influence on the English radicals of the 17th century, who were also an influence on the American founders. So the English Civil War of the 17th century, briefly deposing the king, for example, a long, complicated event, something of which, I don't have much time to talk about, other than the fact that I would assume most people have at least heard of it, maybe not in detail. But it was very important. And the radical writers of that period of time played a big influence on the American founders as well, who were in turn influenced by Machiavelli, as well as Machiavelli also having a direct influence on the American founders as well. Now, it may seem, a long ways off, but, it's only, a little over a century or so, the English Civil War from the American Revolution. So it's not that far off. I mean, it'd be more or less, how we would look back to somebody like Marx and Engels and their period of time. There were many utopian books written during this period of time. Just within an English context, you have Thomas More's Utopia from 1516, kind of the earliest of them. But in the next century, you have Francis Bacon's unfinished novel, New Atlantis. Many of them are sort of works of fiction. James Harrington's The Commonwealth of Oceania, Margaret Cavendish's The Blazing World. And these are all, again, utopian works. They're all works that seek to describe what an ideal society would be like. And utopian, either fiction or, whether it takes the form of a fictional narrative or kind of a philosophical treatise, has a very long history, and then it certainly exists outside of the English context, but it, exists throughout history, really. I mean, Plato. I mean, Plato's Republic could in many ways be considered a kind of utopian work as well, an attempt to describe what an ideal society would be like. But anyway, these kinds of very strong, radical, and utopian influences, arguably played a very strong role on the American founders. So for Machiavelli, power is always a constituent power, meaning the power must find its source within the people. Power is not just some sort of transcendent force that exists over or above the people, but it must sort of emerge sort of from the ground up, basically. Now, this idea to a large extent actually predates Machiavelli and can be found, for example, in another Italian thinker, Marsilius of Padua, who often gets overlooked in his book, Defensor Pacis, or The Defender of Peace, which is written about 2 centuries before Machiavelli. So Machiavelli's discourses date from the early 16th century. This would be written in the early 14th century. And Marsilius makes a very similar argument. The power comes from the people. The power is simply an extension of the people's will, essentially. And of course, we've seen this argument in various other forms since then as well. Now, what maybe separates Machiavelli a little bit from Marsilius is that Machiavelli also assumes that power is also in conflict. So Marsilius was sort of an advocate for, again, monarchical power. He was a strong critic of the church, this idea of sort of, papal authority, the authority of the Pope. He argued very strongly against that, but seemed to argue in favor of strong, absolute power, monarchical power. Machiavelli argues that no, power is actually in conflict, that there is sort of different sources of power, since it sort of emanates from the people, and they're sort of in conflict with each other. And the trick, of course, is to sort of organize these different sources of power in a way in which it can be productive and beneficial. And again, of course, for Machiavelli, this is done through a republican form of government, not a monarchical form. It's not true democracy, it is democracy with these sort of other sort of layers of power on top of it, but the source of it comes from democracy. It comes from the people itself. So it originates within the people, but as it reaches higher and higher levels, as it becomes more and more organized, it sort of, incorporates these different forms as well, aristocracy and monarchy. So Tocqueville would, analyze this in Democracy in America, but he's much more cautious than Machiavelli is. Tocqueville sees, the potential power of democratic life in America, which again was never a direct democracy, of course, but something which sort of originates, they would argue at least, in democratic form from the people, but is sort of refined and controlled by, checks and balances and by, Republican institutions. And again, he realizes, the potential power of this, but is also somewhat, cautious of it as well. Hannah Arendt, a more, contemporary political theorist, is much more sort of effusive in her praise for it. And she sees America as the site of the invention of modern politics itself, according to Hart and Negri. So she's so America is basically, synonymous with modern politics, that everything prior to the American Revolution and the Constitution is basically just, from another era, another political era entirely. So when we get into, examining now a little bit the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, I mean, how do we understand these things in relation to each other, right? Many would argue, of course, that they are the Constitution is sort of like the logical extension of the Declaration, that they are complementary to each other. Some would argue that there is a conflict, that these actually represent opposite principles, that the Declaration is actually the radical moment of the American Revolution, whereas the Constitution represents kind of a conservative backlash against it. Then say, okay, we're going to sort of, clamp down a little bit on these popular passions and things like that. We're going to, again, establish a more orderly system of government. We're going to reduce the power of the people, essentially, and create a more, elite system of government. Of course, in between, you have the Articles of Confederation, which created, very, supposedly a very flawed system of government. So it is important to keep in mind that, despite the importance of limited government power within the Constitution was explicitly an attempt at creating a stronger government than what had existed, prior to that. So when we explore the idea of justice and the idea of the consent of the governed, of course, you won't find any better expression of that than in the Declaration of Independence itself, which says here, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So again, justice plays a very important role here, as we've been talking about throughout the class, basically. But that justice comes from the consent of the governed, that you can't have a just political order unless the people over which you're governing give their consent. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Very famous saying, of course. Now, in John Locke's second treatise of government, he defines natural rights as life, liberty, and property, which sounds obviously very familiar to the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Interesting that Jefferson, who wrote this, substitutes property for the pursuit of happiness. It could be, of course, that is because most people didn't actually own property back then. I think that's very, very, very likely. Later on, the British writer G.K. Chesterton would call this the creed of America. This is essentially like the religious dogma of American life. Chesterton's kind of an interesting writer. He was a Catholic within England, a very Protestant majority country. Strangely enough, he's an influence on the writer Neil Gaiman and his comic The Sandman. He actually appears in the comic, and I believe he appears in the new Sandman TV series as well. So again, when we look at the Constitution now itself, and this will be, I'll be getting into the wrapping up phase of the class now. The president, performs the role of the monarch, the executive branch of government. The Senate and the Supreme Court play the role of the aristocracy. Now, Hart and Negri say that it's just the judicial branch of government that plays that role. I would argue against that. I would say quite clearly the Senate is meant to play a kind of aristocratic role. It is considered the upper house of Congress. And of course, until basically, 1913, you couldn't even vote for your senators. So that power is, taken out of the hands of the people altogether, basically. It's not based on population. Every state has 2 senators, no matter what. So I think you can make a very good argument that the Senate is meant to be more of an aristocratic branch of government. And it's really the House of Representatives and arguably maybe the state governments that play more of the democratic. And again, going back to Hart and Negri, they see this as an example of what they call network power. So again, power is not centralized, but it sort of exists in this kind of network, which is by definition decentralized. It's a decentralized structure where power has no center, but circulates through the network, what they call a democratic interaction of powers linked together in networks. And again, this sort of serves as the model for what they call empire, that empire on a global scale is decentralized, that there's no center of empire, so they would say, but it sort of exists in this sort of decentralized network. And they speak of this in very, effusive terms. They say that the American system is an idea that rediscovers the revolutionary humanism of the Renaissance and perfects it as a political and constitutional science. They perfect it. I mean, think about that. I mean, it's harder to, praise it more. They contrast this with what they call the modern concept of sovereignty, where power is conceived as something transcendent above the masses. So they, generally identify this with European power. That in Europe, at least at that time, politics, the political rulers were, basically existed above the society. And that was sort of what they advertised to a certain extent. The idea that they're sort of above the fray, that they're not sort of bogged down in the petty squabbles and conflicts among the people, and even among the upper classes. But that the ruler, the monarch, for example, is supposed to be, above all this, which of course is, bullshit. But that's what they, again, essentially advertise themselves as. And so, Hart and Negri are extremely, critical of that concept of sovereignty, and rightly so. The question, though, which I've been sort of, alluding to throughout the class, is really how democratic is the American political system. They seem to argue that it is. They say it's essentially a perfect system. They associate it with the revolutionary humanism of the Renaissance and things like that. Well, now let's look at another quote from Hamilton. So this was written in private. This was not meant for public consumption. So Hamilton writes, all communities. Sorry, I heard something. All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the other the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. And however, generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true. In fact, the people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give therefore to the first class a distinct permanent share in the government, meaning the upper class. They will check the unsteadiness of the second, and as they cannot receive any advantage by a change, they therefore will ever maintain good government. Can a democratic assembly who annually revolve in the mass of people be supposedly steady to pursue the public good? Nothing but a permanent body can check the imprudence of democracy. It is admitted that you cannot have a good executive upon a democratic plan. So very negative views towards democracy. And one of the motivating, forces behind the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was an event known as Shays' Rebellion. And what this was basically Revolutionary War veterans who were highly in debt. So again, debt coming up here. There's about 4,000 of them who took up arms and basically were sort of going after tax collectors and government officials who are basically trying to collect debts. And it turned into a big thing. It was put down by force by Henry Knox, who was entrusted by Washington to do this. This is before Washington becomes president, by the way. So Knox writes in a letter to Washington, something which I think is very interesting. He says, their creed is, meaning the rebels, that the property of the United States has been protected from confiscation of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. So where else have we heard this idea of common property? And he that attempts opposition to this creed is an enemy to equity and justice and ought to be swept from off the face of the earth. Well, of course, the opposite is what happens, and the Shays rebels were the ones who were swept off the face of the earth. But through great exertion of force. And it's believed that the weakness of the government, the fact that the government couldn't resolve this any other way, really serves as a major catalyst, basically, in the Constitutional Convention leading up to this. So again, I'll just address a couple of voices here. Just take a very critical view of the idea that the United States represents a democratic order. One very influential book was written in 1913 by Charles Beard, a book called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. And Beard is quite explicit that, the Constitution is basically formed to protect the property interests of the upper classes of both the North and the South. They were different. The ruling class of the North was a commercial class and, heavily involved in trade. And of course, the Southern ruling class were the slave owners, the plantation owners. But they had sort of a commonality in the idea that they want to protect their property from the common folk, the people who wanted, relief from debt and wanted to redistribute land and things like that. So this is a very markedly different view from the very sort of, rosy, optimistic view that Hart and Negri take of the American politics or the American political system. So Beard writes in chapter 2, he says, the Southern planter was also as much concerned in maintaining order against slave revolts as the creditor in Massachusetts was concerned in putting down Shays' desperate debtors. And the possibilities of such servile insurrections were by no means remote. Every slave owner must have felt more secure in 1789 when he knew that the governor of his state could call in the strong arm of the federal administration in case a domestic disturbance got beyond the local police and militia. The North might make discriminatory commercial regulation, but they could be regarded as a sort of insurance against conflagrations that might bring ruin in their train. It was obviously better to ship products under adverse legislation than to have no products to ship. And this talk about commercial regulation, things like that, refers to the tariff, which was something that split the Northern and Southern ruling classes. The Northerners wanted a high tariff so they could stimulate industry. Southerners wanted a low tariff. So they had definitely differences from each other. But what they both wanted to do, above all else, was to protect their property. And so that, I think, very much sort of contradicts the views that Hart and Negri talk about the so-called democratic basis of this order. And many people were, highly critical of the Constitution. Notably, William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, who wrote that the Constitution was a covenant with death, an agreement with hell, literally during a public ceremony where he burnt a copy of the Constitution. This, of course, is the Electoral College, one of probably the worst institutions of the American constitutional system. This is from some right-wing, website, which is basically bragging that the states in blue have a smaller population than LA County. The Electoral College ensures that they have the same voice as the coastal elites. So they love this idea. But what they're basically saying is that, yes, all these states where you have, significantly less of a population plays a very important role in determining who the president of the country is. And obviously, you know, their framing of the argument is quite absurd. According to them, everybody that lives on the East and West Coasts, or the Northeast and the West Coast, are part of the elite. Is that true? Are we part of the elite? Are we part of the coastal elite? Is everybody that lives in New York City part of the coastal elite? You know, the cab drivers, the store clerks, the baristas, the people living in the South Bronx and other areas, Bed-Stuy, are they all part of the elite? I mean, it's an absurd argument, but this is how, you know, people try to rationalize, you know, the very undemocratic, you know, features of the American system. And I'll leave things here with one last quote from Sheldon Wolin, who wrote an article called "Inverted Totalitarianism." Also, you know, around the same time that Hart and Negri are writing as well, but takes a markedly different view of the American political system than they do. And in his mind, you know, what he refers to as inverted totalitarianism is essentially, why it's inverted is because, you know, whereas in so-called classical totalitarianism, you know, politics basically dictates economics, or the political sphere essentially controls the economic sphere. In his version of things, it's become upside down. Now economics dominates politics. So another name for this, I suppose, could be something like corporate totalitarianism, or maybe corporate financial totalitarianism. Essentially, totalitarian control in the service of corporations, which of course is highly undemocratic. But anyway, I'll just read this one quote here because it kind of, you know, runs through, you know, most of the major American institutions. So he says, thus the elements are in place: a weak legislative body. So Congress is kind of weak, you know, in the face of the power of the so-called imperial presidency. A legal system that is both compliant and repressive. So what he means by that is fairly interesting, right? What he means by it being both compliant is that the legal system, the courts and things like that, you know, play a very little role in really, you know, regulating, again, the power of the executive branch. Think of government, you know, spying and surveillance and things like that. Think of the, you know, illegal detention of people, throwing people in jail, or shipping them off to Guantanamo Bay and things like that. Also think about in terms of Wall Street, even though this was written several years before the financial crash, the fact that the blatantly criminal, fraudulent activity of people on Wall Street basically went unpunished. So you have this sort of compliant legal system for the wealthy and for the powerful. But what happens if you're, you know, a poor person? Then the power of the state comes down upon you very hard, right? And you get thrown in jail for long periods of time for, you know, possession of marijuana and, you know, for, you know, non-violent crimes and things like that. So, you know, in other words, you know, a tough legal system if you're poor, a very permissive and tolerant legal system if you're wealthy. And of course, you could extend that to the federal government as well when it comes to, you know, exerting power over people. A party system in which one party, whether in opposition or the majority, is bent upon reconstituting the existing system so as to permanently favor a ruling class of the wealthy, the well-connected, and the corporate, while leaving the poorer citizens with a sense of helplessness and political despair. And at the same time, keeping the middle classes dangling between fear of unemployment and expectations of fantastic rewards once the new economy recovers. So again, basically, you know, we have two political parties. I mean, other countries have much more than that. But he's basically saying, you know, whatever party is in power doesn't really matter. And, you know, again, if anyone thinks otherwise, you know, let me know. I mean, stop me or you know, leave a comment when I'm reading something here that isn't in fact true. That scheme is abetted by a sycophantic and increasingly concentrated media. Sycophantic is kind of a nice word for saying, you know, an ass kisser, that the media sucks up to people in power rather than holding them accountable. And certainly, you know, again, the run up to the Iraq war would be a perfect example of that. By the integration of universities with their corporate benefactors. That's another important thing. Universities are basically run as, you know, for-profit businesses now. They take a lot of money from corporations and from wealthy individuals, which you have to wonder, does that sway them in some way? Especially when it comes time to give out, research grants and things like that. What kind of research is actually going to be funded and what isn't? By a propaganda machine institutionalized in well-funded think tanks and conservative foundations, by the increasingly closer cooperation between local police and national law enforcement agencies aimed at identifying terrorists, suspicious aliens, and domestic dissidents. So Wallen's view, whether it's written fairly recently or Beard's view written, over 100 years ago, I think certainly, introduce a different point of view from what Hart and Negri have to say. Who, again, their analysis is very much based upon Machiavelli, based upon Polybius, and things like that. So, that's sort of the essential theme here. To what extent are Roman institutions an influence on American institutions? I think that's there is certainly influence there, but I think it's very much a debatable question to what extent this represents a democratic political order, and whether or not it may be a relatively stable political order, but even that you can question now. But I think it's an order that's much more of a kind of elitist, kind of oligarchic political order. All right, so that pretty much wraps up what I have to say now. So next week we'll have the midterm. And I will post that next week. There won't be a class like this next week then. The midterm works, it'll basically be for the short answer questions. It'll be drawn, essentially from the main ideas that we've been going over in class. There'll be one about the Arestia. I haven't exactly worded the questions yet, but, we one basically about, the sort of process of political transition that you see within the Arestia, from monarchy to tyranny to democracy. There'd be a question about justice in Plato. There'd be a question about the regime types in Aristotle. I probably won't ask a question about Cicero, but I'll probably ask a question also about, how Roman institutions are an influence on American institutions. So that's that. Basically, a typical answer for that should be about, 1 to 3 paragraphs long. Let's say that's a short, basically a short answer response. I will post the exam on the day we have class. I'll post it even earlier than we have class and give everyone basically the whole day to complete it. Hopefully it will be completed the same day. I know I've been pretty loose with the rest of the schedule. If you do not think that you should need it, and I realize I'm recording this now and many people won't hear this until later on, but let me know if you can. I could leave it open for the entire week, but that'll just mean it'll be that much longer before I get a chance to grade the exams. If they're all completed within the same day, I can obviously get to grading them sooner. So let me know if that works for people. I would like to try to have it basically, just on one day, on next Wednesday. You can take it any time during the course of the day to try to put some time aside from that, whether it's in the morning or in the evening or whatever. I think that's pretty much it as far as that goes. Again, you have access obviously to the recordings of the class, to the PowerPoints. The discussion questions I think are very highly based upon the questions that I'll be asking for the midterm exam. So look closely to those things. Hopefully, if you've been doing the assignments, and it looks like most people have, try to choose quotes that you think reflect the main idea of the reading. Don't just choose something because it's on like the first page or something like that. All right, so I think that's pretty much it. If there's no questions for me, we'll just wrap things up here. Yeah, Jerome.
So something I was wondering about is just a question, I might be wrong, but from all the classes we have done yet, I feel that you mostly understand politics through the lens of distribution of resources, of the distribution of wealth. And my question is, would you identify as a Marxist or neo-Marxist? I was just curious about that.
Do I see it mostly a Marxist way, yeah, I do.
All right. Sorry, I interrupted you. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say. I mean that's that is pretty much how I view it. It is mostly about, yes, resources. Politics is essentially a way of dividing up those resources in many regards. I mean, even when countries go to war, I mean, you could certainly argue that a lot of that plays a role in that as well. So yeah, I would say so.
All right. Thanks a lot. It's an interesting perspective.
Okay. All right, thank you. So, all right, so I guess that's it then. So we'll break here. All right, so take care, everyone.
Have a nice day.
You too, take care.
Thank you. Have a nice day.